So during this section, we're going to cover police psychology. This goes over a few different topics, but in this particular section of police psychology, we'll be going over selection and testing. So selection of police broadly encompasses psychological tests, training, and then eventually we'll get to psychological effects of policing, such as burnout and isolation, which some of this selection and testing is supposed to help keep from selecting officers who might be more inclined to burn out or find some of these negative effects. So, unlike many jobs, becoming a police officer often requires a series of psychological tests to be considered. Why would we be interested in psychological testing of police? Well, police need to make very quick judgments, particularly concerning others and their own safety. They're also constantly in stressful situations. They're dealing with people who might be in some of the worst moments of their life, depending on whether it's a suicide call or a string of other situations like domestic violence. Um, they also have to be familiar with local laws. They can't just be running around and arresting anyone or not doing their job. So, knowing local laws based on state and county are crucial to being able to determine when they need to intervene. Additionally, the police need to be tested for people skills because their job is to interact with people every day, and many of these people are difficult to deal with. If you can't deal with people, then you probably aren't going to do a very good job of working on the streets as a police officer. So, additionally, these psychological tests are intended to keep people out who should not be police officers um, rather than uh, essentially who would be the best fit for the job. So we're screening out people rather than selecting in. These tests are meant to identify those who are unfit instead of those who are most fit. There is a history of police testing in the US because we haven't always done it this way. In the early 1900s, psychological tests were used to help select those who will train to become police officers, um, but they varied. So in 1917, officers were tested on their intelligence, and researchers recommended candidates should score at least an 80 to be fit for the job. So most reports indicate below average IQs early in the 20th century. I think the average IQ then was still around 100, but we were requiring that police have an 80 to be fit for the job. As time progressed, police screenings became the standard, though. So this started in the 1950s when only 14 cities with populations over 100,000 were formally testing candidates. So it wasn't until the mid 1980s that more than 50% of departments used psychological screenings. Part of the shift in screening was a result of changing laws that required more from police. So in the 1930s, for example, appellate courts began reversing convictions that were based on confessions during physically coercive interrogation. So cops were no longer allowed to physically harm people to get confessions and could be sued for lashing out at people. So today, now we find that police are subject to intense background checks, medical exams, interviews, polygraphs, personality assessments, and much more. Um, which is then bringing us to testing today. So, what does testing today look like? Well, police have to pass a series of background checks to determine things like previous arrests and financial credit, possibly. They also go through medical exams to ensure that they are good enough health to complete training and perform on the job. And then selection interviews are much like job interviews, so they're just gauging uh, personal. They're just trying to figure out personally, is this person a good fit? Um, Additionally, officers might be subjected to polygraph testing. So they might ask them questions like, have you ever done any illegal substances? Have you broken any laws, and so on? And then they might do personality assessments and IQ tests, which I'll go over a little bit more in the next slide. But why would we do so much testing? Like, what is so important about police that we feel the need to check into these people more than any other job? This is largely because precincts and local governments are trying to avoid lawsuits from public resulting from poor police misconduct. So we need to be sure that our cops are not going to be people that are getting the job for the wrong idea. So we're doing more testing. Two major components of police selection are those of interviews, which personal interviews are the most widespread employment tool, but are often found to not work well. A structured interview is typically viewed as are typically better, and they're the most psychometrically sound, meaning that they have higher reliability and validity than non-structured interviews. Reliability, as you probably know, is the extent to which an assessment is consistent. So how consistent would this person interview on day 1 versus day 10? Is it reliable? Are they the same person on these 2 different days? Additionally, validity, going back to the psychometrically sound, is validity refers to how accurate the assessment is. Is it answering the question that it's intending to answer? So validity meaning, in this instance, the results of the interview is related to some known outcome that the interview was meant to assess. So are we actually assessing during the interview that this person is fit for the job? So what we do is we have a structured interview where we have a set of questions that are presented in a certain order, and that should give us the best way to interview candidates to determine if they could be good police officers. But this has one major limitation, which you've probably already thought of, social desirability and impression management. Anybody who's done an interview knows that they probably present themselves in the best way possible and possibly don't perform as well on the job. I know that when I interview for jobs, I have great posture and yes ma'am, no ma'am, and maybe on my day-to-day that's not entirely how I behave. So they do have their limitations. So additionally, we also do a lot of psychological testing. This includes things like IQ. So what is back in the 1950s, we were asking that police have an average IQ of at least an IQ of 80. Today, the average IQ for police is 104, so that's within the range of normal intelligence, which is probably good, depending on what standard you want to hold police to. Additionally, we test personality. Specifically, we want to know about psychopathy. In addition to wanting to know about psychopathy, we also want to know about measures of emotional stability. How emotionally stable are you? Because you're going to be in a very difficult job. One specific measure that people tend to use is the Inwald Personality Inventory, which measures like lack of assertiveness, trouble with law and society, undue suspiciousness, driving violations, and other things related to those. So you could see how maybe that would be a better test of who could be a decent police officer in comparison to something like how extroverted are you, or how neurotic are you, and so on. Aside from just testing, now one thing that's beginning to become influential in police selection is higher education. So more and more precincts are requiring applicants to have some form of college degree, whether 2 or a 4-year degree. I looked for more recent data than 2008, and I was unable to find anything reliable. But this graph is showing you, if you see at the bottom, we have state police is in blue and county police is in green. And then on the left hand, we have the percentage of agencies that are requiring either a 2 or 4 year degree, depending on which section they're in. So here you have state police departments in 2008, about 16% were requiring a 2-year degree, and county police, 13% were requiring college degrees. In terms of bachelor's degrees, we're looking at state police less than 5%. So very small number of state police are requiring a 4-year degree. There isn't a green bar because there was not data on this, rather than just no one is doing this. So why would we want our officers to have a some sort of education from a college or university? Well, people who police who have more education, being 2 or 4-year degree, tend to be less authoritarian. So they're more tolerant in their views. They don't necessarily adhere to such high levels of respect for authority and order. So they might be a little bit easier to deal with, especially in terms of the population that they are dealing with. They tend to have higher evaluations from supervisors. So they're doing a better job at their job, and they receive fewer citizen complaints, which is likely due to better community relations. So since they're less authoritarian, they might be having better communication with people that they have to interact with. And then additionally, there are fewer disciplinary actions. So because they have fewer complaints, they have fewer incidences requiring disciplinary action. So they're having less problems with the public. Additionally, what really stands out here is that officers with only high school education account for 75% versus 11% with college degrees in terms of disciplinary action. So those who are getting disciplinary actions consist a majority of officers who have high school educations. But maybe there's a downside to college degree. One problem that might be that we have found is associated with being more educated in law enforcement is that there is lower job satisfaction. So this may be because they're less authoritarian and therefore may question the system more or the laws that they have to impose, which would then make them a little bit more uncomfortable with what they have to do on a day-to-day basis. But overall, seems that higher education has a positive impact on policing. In the next section, we will cover training and psychological effects of another type of education, otherwise known as police training. And so police training, which happens once you're admitted into the academy. So this is if you interview well and you're selected, you might enter the academy, which often is about 24 weeks on average. So this is a pretty substantial amount of time. But there are some criticisms with police training in that it maybe isn't good enough. Well, I should go back. Police training, when they're in the classroom and field work, might involve things like they are doing written tests, so they're learning the laws in paper, and then they're also doing physical tests and going out and working in the field with some sort of supervisor. But there are criticisms, and this is that few fail and drop out of the academy. So some reports indicate that up to 25% of new officers will leave the police force in the first 16 months. So a quarter of people who got through training then are out on the street and decide, oh, I don't want to do this. So is it not giving them accurate information, or is it not training them well enough to do their job well? So is training too easy, or is selection that good? We don't really know. Additionally, people say that there's not enough field training. So most of this training is done in the classroom, and after the classroom portion, cadets will spend some time under the supervision of an experienced officer, but many say that this is just not enough time. You don't get enough situations under your belt to be able to handle them well. Additionally, they may only experience one or few incidents of a certain type. So there's so many different situations in which someone could be into. But some people argue that this is a benefit because the new officers are avoiding adopting the cynical outlook of some of the more senior officers. So, not really sure. And they also might find that they don't get as much cutting corners education from the senior officers. So I'm really sure. I think this is something that is worth testing, but as there are these criticisms, and there's also many would argue that there's not enough time spent on certain topics. So this is like, for example, interacting with mentally ill citizens. This goes back to this: are they getting enough experience with certain incidents under their belt to then be able to handle them by themselves? There's just not much time spent on some of these topics. And later in the policing module, we will talk about new types of training that have come into effect that many officers just don't get at this point.